How constrained do you think we become in our day-to-day corporate roles, and how much do we kill creativity, if at all?
The problem is we don't allow ourselves to hear and listen. I'm a big fan of Native American philosophy and thinking. I think the real key is allowing yourself the freedom, enforcing the freedom in many ways.
If we have a team leader listening today, how can that leader diagnose their team and sense that there is a lack of creativity? Duncan, what is one misconception that people commonly have about creativity that you would like to debunk today?
If you talk to people that go into the world of marketing in major organizations, they will say, I became a marketing director. I went into marketing from university because I didn't want to be a lawyer.
Today, we are going to talk about creativity, specifically how creativity can help when it comes to leadership, business growth, and general resilience. To talk about creativity, we are joined on the show today by Duncan, who has established a truly alternative approach to brand building and experiential team inspiration, energized by an absolute passion for creative disruption and 25 years re-inspiring and reconnecting global marketing teams with their brand's dream, rhythm, and direction. Duncan is proud to have worked with hundreds of the world's most iconic brands, from Adidas, British Airways, Samsung, Unilever, PepsiCo, General Mills, Nestlé, to Cirque du Soleil and Alliance. He's co-authored The Dream Cafe, Lessons in the Art of Radical Innovation. The Dream Cafe is a philosophy inspired from the avant-garde and is focused on ensuring that every aspect of a brand's journey to market is directed by transformational rather than just incremental innovation and creative thinking. This episode is brought to you by our very first show sponsor, CaptureBee.io. One of the hardest parts of building a business and expanding your personal brand is keeping a steady flow of warm leads and connections. When I first started, chasing leads on LinkedIn was draining, distracting, and let's be honest, not really why I went into business in the first place. Now, just imagine never having to hunt for clients again. No cold outreach, no endless LinkedIn scrolling at 1 a.m., no awkward reels either. That's exactly what CaptureBee does for you. It's a done-for-you outreach service that books warm leads straight into your calendar. And more than that, it can help you get featured on leading podcasts so that you can elevate your personal brand at the same time.
Duncan, I'm really excited about this recording. I've known about your work for quite a few years. Mm-hmm. I really want to start by asking you, what does creativity mean to you? Oh, I like the deep breath. That's usually when you get a good answer.
Creativity is one of these words that is overused and underused and not really understood. So it's a great question. For me, I think it's about the freedom of intuition. It's about the ability to access gut feelings and a real flow of ideas and energy. And I think, it's particularly noticeable with artists, visual artists. And I love some of the sort of documentaries you get on people like Picasso. And when you see either the real Picasso painting actually is one of the best examples. There's some good stuff on YouTube where Picasso's painting on glass and the camera's the other side of the glass. And he's painting on it. And you can see how his mind is flowing, and a chicken becomes a vase, a vase becomes a dog, becomes a goat, becomes a flower, and it's just that flow. So for me, creativity is the release of intuition.
I love that you mentioned that, and I hope you don't mind me being a bit provocative here, but I feel that perhaps that example that you gave with Pablo Picasso is perhaps also one of the reasons why creativity can have a bad rep in the corporate world. In other words, one of the reactions that I've experienced from working at, say, law firm or hedge funds is, what does creativity have to do with us? We're white collar, Service provider professionals were bankers, traders, lawyers. Creativity, Pablo Picasso, it's another world. So tell me how creativity can fit in that world.
Probably the best lawyers, in my mind, barristers particularly, advocates, bankers with great ideas. They're highly creative people. I mean, to really break through, to come up with the idea of a new plan, a new investment, a way of protecting someone in a case. It's huge creativity, but it's a label that gets applied to artists or musicians or whatever, or sculptors, and actually it's not true at all. I mean, one of the interesting things I've found over the years is working with a lot of strategic marketeers, brand owners, these sorts of people. If you talk to people that go into the world of marketing in major organizations, they will say, I became a marketing director. I went into marketing from university because I didn't want to be a lawyer, or I didn't want to be an accountant, or I didn't want to be a investment banker. I wanted to do something creative. I've heard that phrase many, many times.
That's right.
And then when I say to them, well, how's it going? They'll say, oh, well, I don't really do much that's creative, which so a lot of my work in my workshops and my processes have been allowing that freedom, that energy that everybody has innately in them to come out and to use it, because they're not given permission. And I'm quite sure your lawyers or your investment bankers, if you said, look, think creatively around this particular issue, give them permission.
Of course, and I couldn't agree with you more that the best are the most creative, right? Because with creativity, there is that emotional intelligence as well, and there is that free flow of thinking. And it's interesting to even realize that, for example, it's creativity that can also lead you to want to have different hobbies or passions. I find, by way of an example, doing this podcast is an opportunity for me to be at my most creative, right? Although there is, of course, a strong intellectual element and the preparation and the questioning, it's a space that I've created and curated for my creativity to flow.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I love that.
And even having the idea of doing it in the first place is a highly creative move. But I find, Charlene, I think it's interesting. Sorry to jump, but is that okay? I do.
Always. You don't need permission here.
But the labels that we have in business are so potentially restricting, but also they mask people's real abilities. And the work that I passionately believe in is allowing disruption to come through, allow creative disruption to come through. There was I won't mention the client particularly, but a very big packaged goods brand that you'll know. Some years ago, I was doing a project, and I was working with consulting with an agency, and the answers weren't happening. The real breakthrough thoughts weren't happening. And I was it was a Saturday morning, which is very relevant, which I always remember. If a client rings you on a Saturday morning, there's usually something wrong, or right, or probably wrong. So my phone rang, and the client rang me, and he said to me, Duncan, I'm really sorry to ring you on Saturday morning, but I've got something important to say. And what I thought he was going to say was, you're fired, basically, because, we've been trying to get this particular thing right. No, what he said was, I've had an idea. And he was so restricted, embarrassed, controlled himself, that he should have had an idea, which was a brilliant idea, which we then at that time took on and grew, and it became a big success. And it's so interesting that, and I'm sure that must be the same in your world, the world of lawyers, particularly, and bankers, and particularly because, should you have ideas? Are ideas okay? Question.
Ideas are part of the services we provide, right? Isn't it at the core of what we do? Ideation.
Yes, and it should be with everybody. I mean, the other thing, though, what I was going to say was that there are all these other labels. So I remember one story very clearly where we were discussing with a group of German business people, actually, the idea of entrepreneurialism, if there is such a word, but being entrepreneurial. And this particular client in the group, in a workshop, said, well, I'm not entrepreneurial at all. You know, I do my job and I do this and I do that and I have my 2.3 kids, and that was his life. You know,
and 2 have cats
yes,
and dogs.
And cats and dogs and everything else. And the idea of being entrepreneurial was a complete anathema to him. About 3 or 4 hours later, I'm a great believer in storytelling and imagination through story and drama and devised thinking in that way. And we were doing something, and the team were talking about their moments of being where something had been an interesting breakthrough in their life, particularly to do with their hobbies. You know, you mentioned hobbies and things. This particular client said, well, what's we all talk about hobbies and things they were interested in beyond work. And he said, my passion is off-road motorcycling. So quite interesting. And racing these, off-road bikes. And he carried on talking, and he said, yes, last year I needed a new bike. I needed this new Honda bike, but I didn't have the money for it. But I phoned up Honda, and I found out that if I ordered 20, I got one free. So I went off, and you imagine what this guy's colleagues were saying, having said that he didn't know what entrepreneurial was. And he said, so I got in touch with all the motorbike off-road clubs, took 20 orders, got my bike free. And everybody was just in hysterics because he was so controlled by the label of being entrepreneurial that didn't fit his specific mantra, if you like. And I think creativity and free thinking in that way is all part of it. These are labels.
How constrained do you think we become in our day-to-day corporate roles, and how much do we kill creativity, if at all?
Hugely.
Tell us more.
Hugely. Well, it starts at school. I don't know if you sing or you did art. The two things at school that are always in jeopardy are in singing and music, or in the choir. And a lot of people will say, oh yes, well I didn't sing very well at school. So when we had the school concert, the music teacher would say, Charlene, can you just stay at the back and just mime a bit because you're slightly off key. And always people say, oh yes, that's me, or I was told I couldn't draw, or I was no good at art or whatever. Which is complete nonsense, and it restricts you for the rest of your life, actually, that you can't draw or you can't think visually. And a lot of the work that I believe in is literally releasing the dam of possibility. And invariably, one of the things I think we've talked about before, actually, was I tend to have quite a lot of tears in some of the workshops we do and some of the stuff I do. And I've always been fascinated by that. And I think it's because the lid has been lifted, and you give people permission. In the corporate world, it's even tougher. I was talking obviously about brands and marketeers and people like that, but in the corporate world, it must be even more rigid and inappropriate to show emotion through what you're doing and true creative thinking.
I'm sure there's been skeptics when you go into an organization and you start a workshop, and even the word creativity. How do you approach that skepticism? I'm sure there are cynists in the room. I'm sure there are people who would rather do anything else but, and I'm sure by the end they're absolutely amazed and they become your true fan. How do you bridge that gap between initial skepticism and results?
No, you're right. There's always massive, particularly with me, some weird English guy appearing in. I've just done a massive project with a big insurance company in Germany, and we had about 80 or 90 people. And out of those 80 or 90 people, that 2-day process started with probably 20% of the people saying, oh my God, who's this guy? What are we going to do? But interestingly, we were talking before before this started, and we talked about, the effect. I was talking to Simon about the effect of COVID and people not going into the office in certain industries, and this particular group hardly they would go in the office maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, and you could see that culturally over the last 3 years or so, 4 years, that's changed the free interaction that would happen when people are just together and doing things. But I think, Charlene, also what one does in the office is terribly important. If you're going to the office, it shouldn't be just there is, the C-suite are in and everybody wants them. You talked about this earlier. Everybody wants people in. If they're in, there's got to be a good reason for them to be in. It's not just the management have decided, say, you can have free breakfasts on Thursdays or you can go home earlier on a whatever. There needs to be a true reason and a connection with people's passion and how that gets into the corporate world. So it's intriguing, and I honestly think that the more corporate, the more in theory rigid the career path is, the more power there should be for creative release, thinking, free thinking, intuition. Intuition's my favorite word. I'm passionate about what I call the happy accident and allowing the happy accident of thought. Some of the greatest products and changes and ideas have happened through a happy accident, not been planned.
How often do we have happy accidents and are in touch with our intuition when we are burnt out, stressed out, overworked, exhausted, frustrated, angry, and the list goes on? So really, how do we kill creativity as grown-up adults, responsible, conscientious, professional that are dedicated to the role and the organization, yet are super squeezed for time, overworked? Is that conducive to creativity?
The problem is we don't allow ourselves to hear and listen. I'm a big fan of Native American philosophy and thinking, and the Native Americans were brilliant at listening and noticing, particularly nature. Understanding, what that noise means or what that weather effect is or whatever it might be. Listening, and to your question about the happy accident, probably they're happening all the time, but we don't notice. And one of my favorite stories is the guy who invented the Polaroid camera. The ones that pictures come out immediately. And
tell us the story. I don't
and
know.
The story is, I'm praising horribly, so anybody listening to this probably has a much more detailed version of it. But there was a guy called Dr. Land who was a scientist, and he was on the beach. I always imagine it was somewhere in California, but it was in the States. He was on the beach with his family and his little girl, who was probably about 8. And do you remember the days when you had cameras and you got to the end of a film and it went and that was it? You had to then take that film and get it processed at the drugstore or whatever. So Dr. Land was on the beach playing with his kids, taking photographs, and the film finished. And he said, we'll stop at the drugstore on the way home and we'll get the pictures developed so we can show them to Mum. And the little girl said, and this is the key, and he heard it, the little girl said, "But Daddy, why can't I see them now?" And that is that happy accident moment, because as a scientist, as a chemist, actually, he thought, well, why can't you? It's just chemicals and putting the right things together around the film that had been taken. And that was the genesis of the Polaroid system. And there's story after story after story of that, the happy accident.
So when you work with organization, is your goal to ignite creativity at an individual level, at a team level, or at an organizational level?
All three, very important. So
If you're enjoying this show so far, I just have a very quick favor to ask you. Could you go ahead and click the follow button or the subscribe button? It would mean so much to me, and it would really help to grow our show so that we can enhance the production, we can bring you the best possible guests, and we can have the most amazing conversations. So if you haven't already done this, please take a moment today to go ahead and click the follow button or the subscribe button. Thank you so much. And now let's go back to this amazing conversation.
The workshops, and I don't really like the word workshops. I tend to use the word event, because they are the stuff that I get involved with, the workshops, the events that I do, tend to stick in people's minds for a very, very, very long time. So I still meet people now who say, 15 years ago I did this, or do you remember when we were on that mountain outside Madrid, or whatever it happens to be. And they are seminal moments. They are moments where a change happened. And the majority of the team will genuinely feel that effect. And I've had situations where it's really changed people's lives dramatically. Sorry, what was the question that you said around that?
The individual, the team, or the organization?
It's a very interesting question, actually, because it's all happening at once. First of all, you understand your colleagues in the process, in the system. One is understanding what the colleagues are doing, and you're thinking, oh, I never saw John behaving like that before. That was hilarious. I didn't know he had that side to him, the entrepreneurial story, things like that. So there is an individual release. Secondly, there is the need for that team to gather together, and then that leads to the corporate direction. Where all this started, there were two, if you're interested, there are two genesis points for me where this all happened. One was I was using a lot of our processes to drive my creative teams, actually my partners in my businesses, to really get out the box themselves and to think more creatively and get it right more often. And I was in Toronto at the time, working, running a business there. And I had dinner. I found myself sitting next to one night a guy, and you know what it's like if you don't know someone and they say, what do you do? What do you do? And he was a psychology professor at Toronto University. And he said, so what's your biggest problem? And I said, my biggest problem is getting my creative team, so people with creative in their title, to take on board strategy, and to really read what the hell's going on, the insight from the consumer, et cetera. And he said, well, let me come and work with you for a couple of days, which is what happened. And that was the genesis for me of experiential learning and using techniques to people to get out of their traditional box of thinking and to think laterally, using all sorts of other techniques, which then the other sort of major moment was some years later. Back in the UK, I had a friend who was one of those American guy, actually, who was one of those traditional team development guys. When there used to be a big sort of phase of people abseiling down mountains, or you take people hiking across a desert or whatever, and to get teams to work together. And I remember one Sunday saying, what are you doing next week? What are you doing next week? And I said, oh, well, I'm in the office doing this, that, and the other. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm taking the board of directors of a major FTSE 500 company on a Jeep safari across the Sierra Nevada. And I said, I want a bit of that. And that began to open up ways of doing things that released traditional thinking, disruption.
So Duncan, are you telling us that you don't do your experiences inside the office and sat down at a desk?
No, we don't. And it doesn't work online, sadly. Follow-ups work very well online, but in this day of Teams and Zoom and etc., it's too easy to. It's very interesting, Charlotte. I had a meeting this morning at 9:00 in real life.
I love how nowadays you need to
I know, you've got to say that.
specifically add that in.
Face to face.
Face to face.
Face to face. And this happened this morning, and I left that meeting realizing that probably we had an hour for a start, and then most Teams meetings are usually half an hour, and it stops, bang. Oh, sorry, I've got to hop off on the next one now. Click, and you're gone, in an instant. What happened this morning, probably out of the hour, half an hour was what we really needed to talk about. But why it was an important meeting was the other half an hour sprinkled around that hour, which was a bit about this person's life, where they live, sort of conversation you and I had before this started, where you get the, you manage to touch the soul, the magic, the spirit of that person, and perhaps what they're really thinking. Without going into details now of the conversation you and I had, meeting now, but it's changed the energy in the way that I'm thinking about you and your business and this session, really, because the stuff that doesn't happen online is allowed to live. It's organic.
Where do you take people?
My goal is to completely disconnect people from their normal day-to-day work and journey. Particularly if you're thinking about, whether it's a law firm or whether it's a brand of breakfast cereal or whatever, it doesn't matter.
Can't think of any. Can't think of any you've worked with.
But the goal that I have is restrictions. And to do that, you mentioned you don't do it in the office. No. Location, really important. Doesn't have to be exotic or expensive or whatever, but it has to be different. Ideally somewhere where the team who are involved have never been before, so it's new territory. And interestingly, we've done this in city centres of Milan and New York and Madrid, London, and we've done it in extraordinary places on top of Swiss mountain tops and sort of yoga retreats in the middle of North Carolina, and I mean, you name it, I've probably done it everywhere. And the automatic assumption is you need to be on a mountaintop in Switzerland or something. No, it doesn't matter. Even if you're in the center of a major city like New York, it's about opening the door of possibility and going on. So some of it is borrowing from the world of the surrealists. I'm particularly interested in all of that. How did the surrealists create new things in the over 100 years ago? Where are you? 2025? Yes, more than 100 years ago. And the famous Black Cat Cafe in Paris. What actually happened there? It was an extraordinary coming together of extraordinary people. So you would have, novelists, artists, prostitutes, musicians, actors, actresses.
Good combo.
Complete muddle of people who were just mixed together. And the Surrealist movement came out of that extraordinary melange of different thinking, different brains, different powers. One of my favorite films is Midnight in Paris, a Woody Allen film. And that is very much that story, although that focuses on the 1920s, which is the second time it happened in Paris, with Picasso and Dali and Hemingway and all these people. But they were friends. They got together, friends or enemies or lovers or whatever they were. And then they would create, because they would be almost prodded, if Ernest Hemingway's talking to Dali, where does that go? And I try on my processes to borrow a little from that magic. So we use visualization, art, storytelling, music. And back to a question you had a few moments ago, the cynicism factor is often, blows up on moments. But interestingly, the people that are often the most cynical and the most, I'm not doing this, sit back and cross their arms, are invariably the people who have been most passionate in the end, and the people who have often ended up quite emotional. I had that recently in the States, in Minneapolis, and the senior client was known to be a bit of a dragon, a bit of a hard-nosed person. You know a few, probably a lot more than me. And her team were amazed because, towards the end of this particular event, she was very emotional. And we've all got that in us, we put on these masks, don't we? Particularly in the world that you spend a lot of time in the corporate world, in the legal world. You've got to wear the right things, you've got to dress appropriately, you have to have your hair appropriately. They're all masks, and that sort of carries on. And do people through their true self. So another quick anecdote actually was we were working with, it was on a very famous chocolate bar. And it was a pan-European team of people. And this particular bar had some qualities to it. It had biscuits and caramel and chocolate and other things in it.
You're going to make me hungry.
Yeah. And we spent about half a day asking people to, talk about this product. And this was in the very early days of what I was doing and how it evolved. And they just weren't excited. They weren't interested. And I remember having dinner with one of my colleagues, and we didn't sit with the clients that night. It was a 2-day thing. And we had dinner, and I said the words to him. I said, they must be excited and interested in something. So he said, I tell you what, let's get back together all after dinner. And that was the question. And suddenly, of course, the dam breaks, and you've got people talking about loving to go traveling in Thailand. They bred dogs, they went sailing, they had 55 children, they played in a band or whatever. And that was so interesting because it was all there. And I'm sure it's exactly the same in any business. It's all there. It's just whether you lock it down.
Yes, absolutely. And it's fascinating to find the quirks, right? And the odd passions and interests.
And they're so valuable.
They are. They really are.
Yeah.
They really are. Now, I get a better picture now of how that works at a corporate scale. But let's say we have Joe listening to this podcast today, and he really wants to know how can he individually rekindle his creativity. It feels a bit dull and dead at the moment. He's been, loving his corporate life, 30 years of it, and not feeling that he has this joie de vivre spark and feels perhaps a bit jaded, not particularly creative, and does recognize that although he has a very corporate role, he doesn't have that spark and that ideation is kind of lagging. What could someone like Joe do on a day-to-day basis to be more in touch with his intuition and his creativity?
Well, I think it's tough for that to change by Joe on his own, by himself, reading a book, watching a podcast.
This is not going to be enough?
No.
Duncan,
no,
please. I thought that was it.
But there needs to be a launch to reboot that Joe's thinking. So there needs to be something in my mind that reboots restarts the hard drive, and that needs to come from the sort of 1 or 2 day event that I specialize in, and I believe in passionately. And once that happens, then there is the opportunity for Joe or whoever it is to remember how they felt and get close to the emotional reaction they had to the things that they did. So, a lot of what I do with teams will be seemingly very simple. So there's nothing terribly scary, no one's running around naked into ice baths or anything. But by using music, movement, story, theatre, devised thinking, walking in a particular way, by using those techniques, the people will realize that there's a different way of doing things. So one of the big things I always do, and it sounds so simple now, is what I call a medicine walk, a Native American medicine walk. Now, a Native American medicine walk, medicine being wisdom in Native American parlance, but a medicine walk or a medicine experience in Native American tribes, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, would be the young braves would be thrown out into the forest or the desert or wherever they happen to be, no clothes, no food, no weapons, nothing. And if you come back 8 or 9 days later and you've survived, you have come of age, and the experiences that you've been through. I have a technique which does that in just under an hour, and it's honestly, Charlie, it's quite extraordinary. And I've done hundreds and hundreds of these now, and it's quite amazing because although in theory, I won't go into the detail of it now, but in theory, all they've done is gone out into nature or in the city, but with a particular brief from me of how to behave on that adventure, that journey. People come back with real change. So to answer your question, I remember one lady coming back and saying, I now go for a walk in a complete different way. One gentleman I remember who was sort of middle-aged guy, when he went out, he didn't walk very far. He saw a tree and was called to climb the tree. And when everybody was supposed to be back at the venue about 50 minutes later, and he didn't turn up for about 2 or 3 hours, and we were getting slightly worried. And eventually he walked in and said, I just climbed this tree and I just went somewhere, And he's got a bonsai tree on his desk in the centre of London and is in his corporate office now. And he said, I look at that tree all the time, which just drags me back in. So it's not easy. The point you're making is very important. In fact, it's critical because you can slip back very quickly. It's got to be, you've got to keep working at it. Like any muscle, the muscle of free thinking, intuitive thinking, creative thinking needs to be worked. So you need to keep doing it.
I heard a common theme of nature in a lot of what you're saying.
Yes.
How important is nature to our creative energy?
I'm hesitating because, as I say, whether it's the center of New York or it's in a forest in Germany or wherever, the process still works. I think I used the word nature with a small n. I think it's about environment, noticing what's around you, hearing sounds. It's very interesting. I don't know about you, but if you walk through a city, how often, particularly in a city, do you look up? We're here. And now with our phones, of course, we're here, even worse. But look up the next time you walk around Paris or London or New York or wherever it happens to be, and you see extraordinary things, completely different aspects of architecture, or whatever it happens to be. So to me, nature is with a little n. That is still part of nature, the environment that we're in. Yes, if you're in a forest somewhere or the fields in the countryside, it's more obviously natural. But I've always been surprised at the power of opening up to the environment that you happen to be in at that time and using nature in that sense.
When you were talking, I was thinking about the one as a lawyer, but my new background, and one of the training that I took before I became a clinical hypnotherapist was neurolinguistic programming. And we do a lot of work around what you can see, the visual, what you can hear, auditory, what you can feel, kinesthetic, and what you can taste, what you can smell. And our 5 senses, although it sounds so obvious when we say it now, how dissociated are we, right, from those 5 senses? And sometimes just taking a minute to actually be in the now and experience fully what you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste.
Exactly. Whether it's, psychotherapy, neurolinguistic programming, quantum thinking of some sort, whatever it is, the connection is always there. It's the same root, which is, and with neurolinguistic exercise and process, you push yourself into that place for a moment. And yes, it's exactly that. But doing that with a group of 25, 35, 45 people together is another whole interesting challenge, because you've got the interaction and the connection with their colleagues and what they're doing. One of the things that's I love doing is we use art and visualization, massive murals, perhaps 4 or 5 meters long, and we do collaborative art in silence, where people are reacting to what their neighbor, what their team members are painting, what they're drawing, the marks they're making on paper. It's fascinating, because I often tell people not to be polite. So, if you see your friend Charlene is on the other side of the work and she's done something very delicate, and actually you think, no, I want to put a line through that, to go for it. And that
you can interfere with your colleagues' artwork.
Absolutely.
Oof. Oof.
Absolutely.
I can see a few type A's in my mind with some of the organization I work with doing quite happy red marks all over their colleagues.
Yeah, no, exactly.
That's bold.
But, but that's about the permission that people need to have during those events. They need to be... The other thing is being disconnected from our phones, which is a sort of bit of a cliche now, I know. But a friend of mine went last week to a quite a big stand-up comic in London, and I was intrigued. I didn't go, but at the entrance, everybody had to was given a lockable bag that they couldn't open to put their phone in. They held on to the bag, and only when they came out were they given the code to open the bag and get their phone out, because this particular artist didn't want anybody, not because of copyright so much, but actually, if you go to, I've obviously been to many of my children's school plays and those sorts of things, and it's so sad now because everybody's sitting there looking at what's going on stage through a screen, or at a concert. They're not actually there. They're looking at the digital version of there, and it's all of this is the same thing.
When I think about creativity, I often like to think of it as passive or active, and I like to think about the idea of, for example, watching a movie, which is it's not a bad thing. I love watching a good movie, but it's relatively passive, right? You're not really the landlord of the creative space. You're more of you're renting that space, right? It may give you some creative ideas, but you're really not the one designing it. Whereas when you're journaling or writing or even reading a book, you're a lot more active because you are curating a world in your mind and you're visualizing the characters and you're giving them shapes and picturing them. So that creativity is a lot more active. And I find, at least in my personal experience, or when I work with clients who are experiencing high stress and burnout, having them engage in some kind of creative experience.
Yes.
Particularly when it's hands-on.
Yes.
And what I mean by hands-on is not typing. I mean pen to paper or tactile, having something tangible that you can touch, you can feel, you can smell. Almost instantly alleviate that screen anxiety, that called stress. Tell us more. Is that your experience too? And
well, the word that I'm very passionate about, which I use all the time, is co-creative. So it's not about individual creative. The work that I believe in is helping groups of people be creative together, and to breathe together. And to react to things together. It's a bit like, are you a musician at all? Or
I wouldn't. I am a music fan.
Right.
I'm a huge opera
I'm
fan.
still a bass player in an indie rock band, and
Ooh.
we write a lot of music. And if you're a musician, and anybody listening to this who plays music with other people, will understand the interesting dynamic that happens when you're with other people and you're creating together. Then, of course, there's the individual creativity, which is, the author or the writer or the artist sitting all on their own and trying to. The writer's block thing,
Right, of
which
course.
is, how does that happen? Back to surrealists and the surrealism. One of the things that the surrealist movement were passionate about was doing something called a surrealist perambulation. And they would go out and get hold of, buy, connect with the most random of things. And then they would bring them together and create. And the other way the surrealists would do it, you mentioned watching a movie, being passive. They would go out and watch, even in the 1920s, 30s, they would watch 10 minutes of about 8 or 9 films. Only 10 minutes.
Right.
From not necessarily the beginning, but just these bits.
Snippets.
For about 10 minutes of about 8 or 10 films. Then go back in and create with whatever happens. And that's how a lot of surrealism and craziness emerged, because, you're putting, fur with food or, whatever it happens to be. So again, back to the beginning of this very interesting conversation, it is for me anyway, I think the real key is allowing yourself the freedom, enforcing the freedom in many ways, pushing yourself into a place of intuitive thought, and working with other people too. I mean, I'm not a writer particularly, so. But I'm fairly convinced that, if you're a musician, you're writing music and just can't come up with any ideas. If you're working with 4 or 5 others, drums, guitar, whatever, someone will do something which spurs something,
Mm-hmm. Now, we've covered the impact that it can have, but we have an organization or a leader that actually thinks very pragmatically, and I'm sorry to bring the elephant in the room, but thinking about money and the bottom line, right? And profitability of the organization. And he's listening and thinking, Duncan, this all sounds wonderful, very insightful. But frankly, I really care about profitability.
Yes.
I want my numbers to go up. Why should I care about what you're telling me in the context of improving my bottom line?
The proof of the pudding's in the eating. I have had, over a longish career, countless situations where the cynicism is there at the beginning, the budget argument is there at the beginning.
I want ROI, Duncan.
But many millions of pounds and dollars have been made by the effect that some of this process happened. That's not me saying that. It's my clients have come back and said, I was at again, it was a food manufacturing project, so it's in the world of cheese, and dramatically affected through this process the way the team at the brand owner were thinking about this brand. And about 5 years later, I was at another big client meeting and had that discussion. Well, how do we know this is going to work, and what's it going to deliver, and and I spouted a figure of what the effect that this had on this particular brand. And interestingly, there was a voice at the back of the room, a gentleman I hadn't noticed, and he said, "Hi Duncan, you probably don't remember me, do you?" I said, "No, I'm not sure." He said, "Well, I was at that company when we did this. I was the insight director or whatever." And he turned around to his colleagues and he said, "I have to tell you that the figure that Duncan mentioned was massively more than what he said in terms of the effect." So you're right. It's a problem I have is, going cold to people with this sort of discussion is tough, because why would you spend X, to take people in this other place? My proof is, of course, case histories is other clients and saying, well, yeah, that had a major effect on this particular situation. But it's also the individuals. So, back to whether it's the corporate world or any world, really, it's, can you see a change in those people straight away, on Monday morning? What are they going to do differently? Do they do anything differently? And again, time and again, that's been noticed. There was one particular situation I remember when, in a very big organization, one brand in that organization was not the place that everybody wanted to work. It wasn't the sexy, exciting place to be on this particular area. After we did this, I remember going in about 3 months later, and the place was buzzing, and it was the place that all the young interns and the new people in the business and people were wanting to get involved with what was going on there.
I'm really curious. If we have a team leader listening today, how can that leader diagnose, so to speak, their team and sense that their creativity? What are signs and symptoms that can be felt at an organizational level or team level that would be telltale sign that that team is sort of lacking in creativity?
Is such an interesting point. I mean, I think it goes to your expertise, which is the burnout thing. Why are people burnt out? Okay, it might be the work-life balance and the hours and all the commuting or whatever, but probably I would suggest, as a creative director, that the work that they're doing has very little overt creativity and passion involved with it. So my answer to that, but I would say this, wouldn't I, would be, if what they're seeing is dull, back to the situation I was just mentioning, this particular division was not the place people wanted to be. It was a bit drab, it was a bit grey, it was a bit understated. That to me would be a sign that people's personal passion for what they could do. And in the corporate world, of course, people have done years of training and experience and knowledge and wisdom, but it gets drowned. And that's when the clouds descend. And I would suggest that creativity, allowing people, helping people to think creatively at that point would be the sign.
Attrition, turnover as well.
Yes. Oh my God. I mean, the staff.
Sick leaves.
Yes. I mean, incredible. I was listening only this morning, I think, the incredible numbers of people on sick leave, which goes to benefits, which goes to all sorts of things. And probably, if you remember a few moments ago, I was talking about the guy with the off-road motorbikes.
Yes.
If one can access what's really going on in people's minds, and their true passion and really what they're interested in. Okay, no one's necessarily interested in everything about their corporate job, but there will be things in there that are the uncut diamonds, the rough diamonds, and that's what creativity, thinking creatively, understanding the power of disruption. I mean, disruption is the other, intuition and disruption. That's the surrealist thinking, because if you disrupt the way you are. I remember I had a boss years ago who said to me, every month or every couple of months, he forces himself to drive a different way to his office, goes a different route. And I was always found that very interesting, that disruptive thought he had, that he had to go different, for the next 2 months, he wasn't going to go that way, he's going to go that way and end up in the same place.
Tying into what I see on the ground, particularly in the field of burnout, what I noticed was all of the clients and organizations I work with is that creativity is one of the first things that goes when somebody is experiencing burnout.
But let me ask you, they probably don't label it that.
Oh, no. They label it often as the start of a depressive episode,
Yeah.
feeling jaded,
Yeah.
feeling more and more anxious. I personally don't believe that anxiety and creativity can coexist. And I'm talking from, even from a clinical hypnotherapist standpoint, you can't be creative and anxious at the same time. It's a bit like you can't really be stressed and grateful at once. They're states that don't coexist. When I have a client who's experiencing heightened anxiety, bringing them into a trance state that would be, by definition, a creative flow, is an antidote to the anxiety. And that's not magic. That's just brain science, right? You're working with different brain waves. You are immersed in the experience that you've created with your client's mind. And instantly you bring a cascade of positive hormones that are actually happening because of the positive emotions. So the positive emotions trigger positive hormones and triggers a positive state. So again, this is not witchcraft. This is neuroscience, right? Yeah. But it's interesting how it takes one to experience both states to make a connection, right? I intuitively did not think, oh, the reason why I'm no longer interested in pursuing my creative outlet is because I'm burnt out. I'm thinking about when I experienced a very bad burnout episode. But it is when I started to rekindle my creative outlets and felt more in touch with all of those very important things that I do and that fuel not only my creativity, but also my energy. And I think that's also, to me, there is something almost vital about creativity. If I don't create, then I don't feel as energized. And that's something that I hear very often as particularly a burnout advisor, and that also ties into the conversation we were having earlier on. I often get challenged by clients who say, I just followed your journey. You were in Madrid yesterday. You just flew in from New York. You did 5 keynotes last week. You must be jet lagged. Are you sure you're not burnt out yourself? And I embrace that question, and I love that challenge.
And what's your answer to that?
I genuinely feel so energized by the energy that I create during that workshop space, and facilitating that conversation that nourishes me. I mean that so sincerely, and it recharges my battery. And that interaction and that facilitating and noticing the impact and seeing the emotion.
Yes.
It's not a drainer, it's a charger, right? And that's the big piece. And doing all the things that I learned I need to do as my non-negotiable, layered, right? So non-negotiable meditation, non-negotiable sleep. When sleep goes because of jet lag, because of flights, non-negotiable self-hypnosis, non-negotiable workout, movement, running. The things that I've learned over the years enable me to have a solid foundation upon which I can be creative.
But you are super.
It takes discipline.
To deal with all of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not sexy.
But the
discipline, right?
No, and so not my shortcut, but my because I sort of go in as a consultant for a short period of time. The thing that I find so powerful is the co-creativity, as I've mentioned. It's being creative in a way you're not used to doing with colleagues, that suddenly releases almost another level of understanding about each other and your own thought. And I think that's really, really important.
I'm really curious. Do you find that removes some of the layer of the hierarchy?
Very quickly. And in fact, when I'm planning an event, as I call it, I will say to my client, the senior client, I need this to be non-hierarchical, very importantly, and non-specific in terms of experience.
But Lisa, and sorry, I'm being a bit provocative here, but I'm just thinking, because that would be my potential objection. Lisa, who is sitting next to Jeff, is not going to forget that Jeff is her boss just because you told her so. Or is she?
No, yes, I don't agree. I think you can do that. And one of the things I do at the beginning of my processes are the senior client, the boss, or whoever it is, does something I call the dead important speech. And I call it the dead important speech because the more powerful that speech is from the boss, the better the process works. And one of the things that the boss will always ask me, what do you want me to say? What's the dead important speech? And the no hierarchy is absolutely critical. So to your point about Jeff sitting next to Lisa, who's his boss or whatever, I make a big thing. Okay, you can only go so far with it.
Of course.
There is a big thing at the front end which says, anything goes. This is not about the hierarchy or whatever. And particularly if I'm working on something that involves fresh thinking and innovation, often the idea or the germ of the idea will come from the least likely place. And part of that, I often find also if you have salespeople in the process, you talked about the cynicism, they are without fail, before the event happens, they're the people that don't want to be there. They're too busy. They need to deal with their targets, their sales, and incredibly, Charlene, nearly always they're the most passionate and evangelistic afterwards, because if you're that sort of driven salesperson, you've got something really extraordinary in you, to keep pushing that. And if you can just push slightly different neurons within their psyche, it's always interesting.
Duncan, what is one misconception that people commonly have about creativity that you would like to debunk today?
Without question, very easy to answer. I'm not creative, they say. I can't do that. I'm not creative. And that's the thing to be debunked. And it goes back to what I was saying about school, where the art teacher tells you, Charlene, you better not do art going forward because you're not that good at it.
Go be a lawyer.
Yeah, go and be a lawyer.
I was practically told that,
Yes.
so I'm glad
Exactly. I've heard that hundreds of times.
Yes. That's why I was having a bit of a giggle when you asked me about music, because I genuinely remember I had flute, and my flute teacher being like, it's a good job you want to be a lawyer.
But it's rubbish. we do singing often. And we will have a group of 30 or 40 business people sometimes singing in harmony. And if I started off by saying who can sing here, nobody will say yes, or maybe one or two.
It's just, I love that we had this conversation because it makes me think about my childhood, as most things do. And I vividly remember now that episode with the flute, and that stayed with me. And actually, it affected my confidence in my piano ability.
Yes.
So my big sister, Lily, was a very good pianist, and her piano happened to be in my bedroom when she left. So I started to learn the piano. And I wasn't particularly gifted, but because I had this teacher's voice in my head that I was terrible at playing flute, my self-confidence with piano was not the greatest.
Exactly. And I hear this year after year from people. If I've got 25 people in front of me and I'll say, who was told at school that they were no good at their flute or whatever it happens to be? And, half the people will put their hand up, and it's not true. We've all got that. So to answer your question specifically, the biggest thing to debunk is you can't.
You can. Can everyone be creative?
Yes, absolutely. It's partly to do with permission, yourself, but I think this is the power of the crowd, the power of the group. There's something that happens on my events now, and I've done so many that it's not an accident. That it's that release that happens amongst people, and it's quite magical actually. Sometimes I've had clients come back at lunchtime and say, "What drugs did you put in the lunch?" I say, "Why?" Honestly, someone said that. And I said, "Why?" He said, "I've never felt like this before," which is so sad because they should have felt like that a lot.
Duncan, I have one last question for you. I know you are the co-author of a beautiful book. Why should one read it? And what can they expect to learn?
Well, that has been written by my very good friend, and I should mention him because he's no longer with us, Dr. Jeff Crook, who was a professor at Central St Martin's in London. And he ran an MA course, which was called Applied Imagination. And I got absolutely obsessed with the idea of applying imagination. And when we put that book together, it was pre-COVID, but when we put the book together, it's meant to be dipped in and out of. So it's actually A to Z. So you can literally open it at any page and find something that will just stimulate that thought. So if I'm this corporate lawyer, sitting in my office in Paris or London or wherever it is, and need some inspiration, that would be the reason to read it. So you've opened on
a now state of mind.
There you go.
I love it.
That wasn't preempted.
It wasn't,
So,
but it's just beautiful. I love the synergy that just created.
Thank you.
Duncan, thank you. I've
Thank
learned
you.
so much. I feel so
been
creative just talking to you. And I now know, finally, after all these years, why my career as a pianist was interrupted so quickly.
Well, now go and do it again. Get round the piano.
That's it.
Yeah.
Duncan, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlene. Thanks for having me.
If you want to be featured on industry's leading podcasts, you know you need to grow your LinkedIn presence and improve your personal brand, but have zero time to do it yourself. Capture B is your answer. I've been using it myself, and it's been just a game changer. So today, I want to share it with you. If you're ready to grow your business and personal brand without burning out in the process, go to captureb.io. Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe so that you can receive weekly updates. And if today's message resonated with you, please remember to share it with a friend, a colleague, or a loved one who could really benefit from this episode.